There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's late at night on August 30, 2023 in Ivins in southern Utah, and a man is placing a 911 call on behalf of a boy who has just knocked on his door.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here at my front door asking for help. And he's said he just came from a neighbor's house, and we know there's been problems at this neighbor's house.
The child is Russell Franke, one of 6 Franke kids. Their family is pretty famous on social media. His mum, Ruby, ran a YouTube channel called 8 Passengers, where she kept more than 2.5 million people updated on their daily lives. The Frankes don't live in Ivins. They live 4 hours away in Springville. The home Russell has fled from belongs to his mum's business partner, Jodie Hildebrandt. As he urges the man on the phone to tell the police to hurry, he's terrified.
He's emaciated, he's got tape around his legs, he's hungry and he's thirsty.
As the gravity of what this little boy seems to have gone through sinks in, the neighbour falters.
This kid has obviously been... I think he's been detained. He's obviously covered in wounds.
But this is only the start. Soon, police will also find Russell's little sister Eve with similar wounds on her body. They'll arrest Jodie and Ruby. The eldest Franke sibling will tell social media of her relief. Finally, she'll post. Because what's been happening behind the scenes, off camera, behind closed doors to the Franke children, is far worse than the subscribers of 8 Passengers, who have been growing increasingly concerned in recent years, could ever imagine. The abuse has gotten so bad, so extreme, that a judge will compare what happened to little Russell and Eve in that Ivins home in southern Utah to a concentration camp. I'm Gemma, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Ruby Franke and her husband Kevin started posting their family online in 2015 under the pseudonym 8 Passengers. Things like birthday parties, grocery hauls, tips on getting toddlers to sleep through the night, Sunday baking. It was an all-access pass inside their lives, and people loved it. For viewers, it felt like you were part of the family, like you were watching the kids grow up online. But over the years, the criticism grew about the way Ruby and Kevin were choosing to discipline their kids. It was videos like this that first sparked concern.
I know that her teacher is uncomfortable with her being hungry and not having a lunch. And it would ease her discomfort if I came to the school with a lunch. But I responded and just said, Eve is responsible for making her lunches in the morning, and she actually told me she did pack a lunch. So the natural outcome is she's just going to need to be hungry.
But to Ruby, the growing petitions to save her children were simply haters. She wasn't doing anything wrong. As the years went on, the abuse escalated. It escalated to a point where Ruby and her business partner Jodie were both charged with 6 felony counts of aggravated child abuse against the YouTuber's youngest 2 children, Russell and Eve. They were bound with rope, starved, isolated, forced to do strenuous physical tasks for hours and days at a time. cayenne pepper and honey was used to dress their wounds. The details of what these 2 young children endured are almost too horrible to digest. We will be delving a bit deeper into these crimes during this episode, so take this as your warning. we will be sharing descriptions of child abuse. If that's not for you, perhaps give this one a miss. To help us unpack this horrific story and talk us through how a Utah family blogger has found herself facing up to 30 years behind bars for crimes against her own children, we're speaking to the brains behind the Rise and Fall of Ruby Franke podcast. Host Paula Barros and executive producer Jessica Lowther join us now. Ruby and Kevin Franke have 6 children together. Their first was born in 2003. Can you walk us through their family for those who aren't aware who these people are in the first place?
Yeah, so Ruby Franke and Kevin, they were married in December 2000. We found this through our research. And by the time they started their YouTube channel, 8 Passengers, they had been married for 15 years. They met when Ruby was just 18 years old and she had just finished high school, was beginning college at Utah State, and Kevin was 21 and he was also attending Utah State. They met at an apartment meet and greet at Ruby's new apartment and, they were engaged within 2 weeks. But yeah, they had 6 kids. The oldest is Sherry Franke. The second oldest, which is the oldest boy, is Chad. And then there is Abby, Julie, Russell, and Eve, who was the last baby.
And who were this family? Back in the early days, pre-YouTube, what were they like?
Ruby grew up in the Griffiths family. That's her maiden name. And all of the Griffiths are actually YouTube content creators in their own right. And so it seemed that they were all destined for this online fame that Ruby came to find herself in. And, they're all very good looking. They're well-to-do, as most Mormons are in this area of Utah. And they enjoy playing sports. They're wholesome. They like playing instruments and they love going to church. And it seems like a pretty typical family.
You mentioned that they started their YouTube channel, their family YouTube channel, 8 Passengers, in around 2015. What did their content look like? Was it, like you say, just that wholesome family fun in those early years?
Yeah, so they basically were doing this daily vlogging lifestyle kind of video that would be about a 30-minute video every day, or 30 minutes or less every day. And it was just filming like every moment, big and small. One of the videos that we mentioned in the podcast is when they're finding out the gender of the baby who becomes Eve, but they're gathered around the kitchen island and all the kids are just ignoring the camera for the most part. It seems like it's just a part of their lives, even though this is like one of the first videos. And they're doing the gender reveal. It's a girl. Chad's disappointed. He wants another little brother. There's a lot of girls in this family. But it basically starts as they're just in the car a lot, traveling from place to place. We're going from this lesson to this lesson. But, as their fame or their popularity grew, it became a lot more curated over the years.
And it became quite regular, right? Was it like daily, weekly?
It was a daily video, yeah.
That's a lot of content.
That is a lot of content, and especially for a mother of 6 children to be making this content on a daily basis. And one of our interviewees, Carl Andresen, makes that point. Do you know how much editing and time goes into making these videos on top of being a mother, top of being a parent in general? Is just, that's crazy that they were doing this every single day.
Do we know how much money the family was getting when this was at its peak?
Well, Ruby was rumored to have made at least $5 million.
Wow.
That's what I heard her say in an interview. Yeah, she was like, I was making millions. I was doing fine. I didn't want to, stop doing the 8 Passengers. She does say I was making millions. I was stunned because you do need a lot to make millions on YouTube.
It's based on ad revenue, right? So on YouTube, I'm not sure if many people know this, you have to have at least 1,000 subscribers in order to start monetizing your content. And so obviously she had that pretty quickly into her tenure on YouTube. And so all the ad deals started flowing in and they became bigger brands. And, when she's at this point with 2.6 million subscribers, a lot of brands are going to want a piece of this. That's a huge audience. And it's a direct audience who trusts this woman, who trusts this family to advertise to them products that they might actually use. And, we don't know the reasons why a lot of people watch this channel or were fascinated with this family. But, most advertisers can guarantee that they'll get a pretty good return on investment from a channel like this. And that's why influencer culture has blown up the way it is, because they're seeing a direct ROI, return on investment, because people listen to their favorite people on the internet over their real people in real life.
So when did her content or their content start to become concerning? Or was it that gradual that there's not really a point?
So I'll back up for a second. In order to get a lot of the interviews that we did for the podcast, we infiltrated the 8 Passenger Snark Reddit. And by infiltrated means we just created an account and joined it. And we were asking people, do you want to speak about this? Do you want to speak about your experience being a fan and being a subscriber? And they all said pretty much the same thing, that they started watching it because they really like the kids. Everybody was really emotionally attached to these kids. And it's easy to see why when you watch these videos. They're adorable. They're funny. And especially if you are an only child or you grow up in a home that's not very warm, or maybe like you don't have a great childhood, this is a really good place to find that respite, to find these people that you can attach to and be like, I want my family to be like this. So it's not hard to see why people were fans, but it was around 2019 when Chad disappeared from the videos.
Eat dinner.
Very
Chad,
nutritious.
what are you doing over there? You no texting at the dinner table. No texting.
Let me see it. Let me see it.
People who are loyal subscribers, loyal watchers are like, well, where's Chad? And the comment sections are filled with people wondering, where's Chad? What happened to him? Where did he go? And nobody's talking about it. And it just seems like a little bit of a broken promise to their fans, right? That they had been documenting their daily lives. And then to leave out something as big as one of your children has left, and you're not even saying why or where, that's pretty big news. And so they finally came clean, and they revealed that they had sent Chad off to a camp for troubled teens called Anasazi, and that he had some behavioral issues and was having issues at school that only a camp like this could help him solve. And a lot of people were just dumbfounded by this. The fans, they were saying like, but we didn't see anything that would make us think that Chad was like this terrible, terrible teen. Now, that's not to say that everybody's lives are totally different behind closed doors. Of course, they're probably not seeing everything. But like I said before, it's like a broken promise. If there was something weird going on with Chad, then why wasn't that being talked about? And it had been coming out in like little drips and drabs over time that, he had had his bed taken away from him, and then he had had his door taken away from him. These are pretty crazy punishments, especially in a family of 8. No privacy, and he's the oldest boy.
In our house, when we take something away, it's because they have shown that they are not responsible enough to manage it. And so we don't just turn around and give it back as soon as they start acting good.
It has to be consistent.
It has to be consistent over a minimum of 6 months.
My bedroom was taken away for 7 months, and then you give it back like a couple weeks ago.
I don't think our viewers know that.
You've been sleeping on a beanbag.
I was sleeping on a beanbag since October.
So it was clear that Ruby did not want to be honest with people about what had happened, but she finally came clean. And it almost seemed like this was an opportunity for her to get into these tougher subjects with her fans. So Chad ends up being gone for about 10 weeks. He spent 2.5 months in the wilderness. He didn't shower. Like, they just learned how to survive in the wilderness. And then when he goes to get picked up, Ruby and Kevin stay with him out in the wilderness.
Yeah. He wasn't even upset with them in that way. It's almost like the kids like kind of understood that this was all for their own good. I got the sense every time I'd see the videos and everything. And she did it all in a way where, were like, they kind of understood it and they kind of smiled about it. I don't know if Jessica, you got that sense too.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of kids just inherently trust their parents and trust that they're doing the right thing, especially when so many eyes are on them. They're like, you can't help but think, well, if my mom's filming me and putting this on the internet, she must have my best interests in mind. And if she's willing to showcase her punishments of us, then there must be something right about this. And maybe we just don't know it. And, they're in a very insular community as it is. So it's not hard to see how they would respond to that, as most kids would. I think that you don't start to realize there's something wrong with your parents until you're about, a teenager. So things change after Chad comes home, because now Ruby has learned some of the punishments that Chad was receiving at Anasazi. And I think she feels that she can take her punishments up a notch because it seemed to work for Chad.
And it should be kind of said that these wilderness camps or these troubled youth programs, they themselves are under intense scrutiny in America right now. There are so many different variations of them that have been proven to be abuse, basically.
Absolutely.
So they are being questioned by themselves. The Franke family then send their child to one of these questionable programs. And then, like you say, it kind of gives Ruby this idea that, well, they're doing it, so what's wrong with me doing it? And whenever I watched her videos, I kind of felt like whatever her children did that was wrong, in quotation marks, in her mind, the punishments never seemed to fit the so-called crime. Can you talk me through some of the crimes these kids did and then what the punishments were?
One of the stories that came up over and over again in our research and in our interviews was that Russell, the youngest boy in the family, second youngest child, he left his socks outside. He left his socks outside. What a crime. And Ruby finds this out and she makes him do push-ups. He's 6 years old. 6 years old, and she's making him do push-ups on camera, by the way. And this is posted to their channel. And he's struggling. He's a 6-year-old. I mean, he probably weighs like all of 30 pounds, but it's difficult to understand where you get the connection between physical punishment and leaving socks outside.
Or I think it was Eve, or was it Abby?
Eve. It was Eve.
Forgot her lunch. And she's just so proudly on her channel telling people, well, she's just going to have to go without her meal. The school keeps calling me to bring it, but how is she going to learn her lesson? It's her tone that really, really, it's how satisfied she is with herself for letting this girl starve. And I think she's going to have to go hungry. What her words, I think.
Yeah. She even went as far to say as she didn't want anyone to give Eve any food because she wanted her to learn a lesson. So Eve was making her own lunches at 6 years old, which is crazy enough for a 6-year-old to be making their own lunches for school. And then secondly, she forgot it in the car. Her mom wouldn't bring it back to her. And Ruby's not working. So she's at home. She has the ability to get in her car and drive to the school and bring her the lunch. But she's not willing to do that because she wants to teach her child a lesson. And I just don't understand what the lesson is here. That it's okay to go hungry because you forgot something?
And then also another one, she kept calling her children selfish and that they were exhibiting selfish behaviors or something like that. And then one Christmas, she said, so this year I'm going to give them the gift of repentance, but only the smallest ones. All the other kids got gifts. And so imagine all your older siblings are getting gifts. And she said, and I explained it to them and they understood that this year they're just going to get repentance and boundaries for Christmas.
It just feels cruel.
It is cruel. And that's Russell and Eve, who ultimately are the reason why we're even talking about this case. And so they seem to really bear the brunt of this horrible parenting that Ruby inflicted upon all of her children, but most shockingly towards Russell and Eve.
So around April 2020, Ruby actually calls the police herself because she starts getting threatening messages. Obviously, all of these concerned viewers are starting to get very concerned. They're making petitions. They're calling the police themselves, asking people to intervene. And Ruby calls police herself to say that she's getting threatening messages. Can you tell us about that? Because I think what I find interesting about listening to Ruby in that moment is that she likes to call them haters.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's a very interesting way to help explain away the bad stuff she's doing.
Oh, absolutely. Calling people who are reacting to her parenting style on YouTube, the people who are creating this backlash against her, the people who are starting these petitions, to just minimize it and call them haters just really puts them into this role that like, they don't understand me and they're not a fan. They never were a fan and they just dislike me for my fame, my fortune, my family, my privilege and my beauty, whatever she thinks. And it's easy to just put everybody under the umbrella of haters. And so the first time she calls police about some of these threatening messages she received was on April 27th, 2020. And one of the messages that she receives says, "I'm going to take your family down and there will be riots at the door when the world finds out the truth." And it is a pretty startling message to receive, but I'm not sure exactly what she thinks the police are going to do about a message that she's received online. She also receives a message that says, "You've left your kids outside unsupervised," and that she shouldn't post on social media or there will be trouble. And so now this sounds like a direct threat towards her and her family. So I guess I can understand calling the police on this, but they are really unable to do anything about it. And it doesn't seem like the police really took this seriously at all. The first petition filed against Ruby. So the petitions were change.org, and it was in order to get CPS to investigate the family because they see what's being recorded, filmed, and uploaded. But they wonder what's going on when the cameras aren't rolling, because if she's willing to show us this, what is happening in that home that we're not seeing? So the first petition receives like only a few hundred signatures, but the second one that started the next day receives upwards of 18,000 signatures. And people are going all over Instagram, all over her TikTok, and they're riling people up in the comments. And she feels attacked and she goes on the defensive really hard.
Did Child Protection Services actually do anything in those earlier years?
So we received reports from Brian Schnee, who is the reporter out of KUTV. He's really great. And the records show that between 2012 and 2020, when Ruby and Kevin were still living in their first home, the police department was called to their home 12 times. And the police showed up 9 times, and the Division of Child and Family Services assisted in 4 of those calls. But obviously, we don't know the details of what happened there because that's private. But there were investigations. Yeah. People went to see what was going on, and they didn't see anything concerning.
She still kept her kids.
She kept her kids. Yeah.
Usually in the U.S., they'll take your kids if they see that they're in danger.
Oh, they won't. They won't hesitate to take the children if they see they're in danger. But at the same time, there are a lot of criticisms of these agencies who brush a lot of stuff under the rug. But I'm sure walking into a multi-million-dollar mansion in Utah with these 6 beautiful blonde children and their beautiful parents, seeing that they have food in the cupboards, toys to play with, that they're groomed, they have a place to sleep. Those are just usually the telltale signs that kids are okay.
Yeah.
If any one of those things are missing, then there would be more visits, there would be regular check-ins. But that's not what happened here because they couldn't find anything that would make them believe that they were being abused.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Paula Barros and Jessica Lowther about the rise and fall of Ruby Franke. Let's bring in Jodie Hildebrandt. She's a big part of this story. Tell us who she is, and more importantly, how did she get involved with the Franke family?
Jodie Hildebrandt was based in American Fork, Utah. She had worked as a therapist and an educator for this program called Connection since January 2007. And she had served as like a program director for Cirque Lodge from 2003 to 2007. And the Connections classroom that she had started offered counseling courses and It was based on her experience at this lodge, this rehabilitation center that focuses on treating addiction. And she was popular in her own right for being a therapist. And because of her close connections with the Mormon church, she was often recommended as a therapist to a lot of families going through any issues that they would talk to their bishops about. She was being assigned to them. Now, she lost her license at a point in time to practice therapy. And so the pivot she makes after she loses her license is to become a mental health fitness coach. And that's not a real thing, but there's no law against it. And there's no licenses that you need. And there's no checks and balances, basically. And so she ends up running this company, serving as a quote unquote therapist, but a mental health fitness coach. And she seems to have a very exact MO. And what we found through our interviews and research is that couples would be going through marital issues. They would go to their bishops at their church. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is what they're called now. They would go to their bishops and they would ask for marriage counseling. Jodie Hildebrandt would be assigned to them. And what would end up happening was, it would be fun and games at first. It would be light and she would really get on your good side. And I'm sure she's a charismatic leader, as most people who want to start cults are. Mm-hmm. She earns the trust of these couples. And then what she does is she separates them. She separates them into these different camps. And so there's a men's classroom that she's teaching in, and then there's a women's classroom. And one of the most egregious things she did, aside from the obvious, aside from the abuse we now know about of the Franke children, was Adam Steed. Adam Steed was actually famous in his own right from even before this story because he blew the whistle on the Boy Scouts of America. He was abused by his camp leader at Boy Scouts, and it was rampant and it was loud and people knew about it and they swept it under the rug. And this is going on in a lot of organizations in America. It's just actually crazy how rampant this is. So basically, so they've assigned Jodie Hildebrandt to Adam Steed and his wife. And now that Adam is in his own groups and his wife is in her own group, Adam starts to realize how quickly the narrative is changing from marital issues and solving problems to you are the reason why you're failing your family. You are the reason why your marriage is failing. You are toxic and you are the poison ripping this family apart. And she convinces him.
Yeah. She convinced him that he was addicted to pornography, like a sex addict, all the stuff that he wasn't, but he was completely convinced of that. I mean, she was amazing at gaslighting. I mean, he admits it that he was being told by her that that's what you are. You're a pornography addict. And did she call him anything else? What was the other thing?
Well, she got him sent to jail for sexual abuse because what ended up happening was, and Adam told me this story, and he's told this story on multiple podcasts and multiple news organizations, that he was bathing his baby in the bathtub, his 1-year-old baby, and his wife came in lingerie. And he thought that this was pretty strange because she had been, according to him, withholding sex for a very long time. And he had been asking and she had been denying him. And so for her to all of a sudden come into the bathroom while he's bathing his child in lingerie was strange, but exciting for him. And so he becomes aroused and she then takes this moment, probably from Jodie's direction, and says, "You're a pedophile. You have an erection because you're bathing our 1-year-old child." And she calls the police and he gets arrested and put behind bars for this. Of course, none of this was true, but there's a systematic approach here to ruining this guy's life. And it seems like extricating the man, the husband from the family, the father, is her step one. And step two is convincing the mother, the wife, that they need to now assume that role of the patriarch of the family. And that somehow also includes corporal punishment, and what we found out from what ended up happening in this case.
Right. And then that seems like that's also the same thing that she did with Ruby, right? Because like Ruby goes to visit Jodie, spends a couple days at her place, and then comes back and tells Kevin that they're done, right?
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah.
So she separates.
Yeah. So Ruby and Kevin, who everyone thinks have this great marriage, who have 6 beautiful children together, there's never been a clue that there's anything wrong in their relationship. When Ruby becomes affiliated with Jodie, and I'm not exactly sure how they met, but it's a very quick friendship because she then becomes a part of the Connections classroom and moves away from the 8 Passengers YouTube altogether. And she starts her own journey as a mental health fitness coach. And in this process, she's now growing apart from Kevin, and Jodie takes advantage of this and makes Kevin move out, tells him he can't see the kids. He can't talk to the kids. He has to completely separate himself from the family in order for him to realize he's the poison and he's the reason why their family is suffering. And for what reason, we do not know why they believed that their family was suffering. But Ruby ends up living in Jodie's house in the summer of 2023 after they've separated. Kevin's in his own apartment. They still have the house. We think that the 2 middle children are still living in that house unsupervised because, as we know, Sherry Franke herself, the eldest daughter, called police multiple times to report that her siblings were home alone for days at a time and hadn't been fed. And so she was aware of this. She's an adult now, and I'm sure when she has a moment to share her story, it will be extremely powerful, because to get the first person perspective of what it was like to be that woman's child is going to be insane. But she calls police on her own mother.
Do you think it's right to look at that story and see that Ruby was radicalizing on her own with Kevin in terms of dialing up her punishments and her abuse of her children, and then in comes Jodie and takes that and then just catapults it onto a whole new level?
Yeah, Jodie gave Ruby the permission to take it up another notch. So she was already had questionable parenting tactics before Anasazi, before Jodie, but Anasazi gives her a reason to take it up a notch. And now Jodie is explicitly telling her that it's okay to treat your children like this because you need to come first. Your children should be an afterthought, is almost the thesis of Jodie's work. And Ruby is captivated by Jodie, and nobody can really understand why, because Ruby seemed impervious to criticism, to advice from anyone. And all of a sudden, this woman has her wrapped around her finger. It's mind-blowing. And it's scary to watch someone become radicalized in real time.
Let's go back to August 2023. You've already set the stage for us in that Ruby and her 2 younger children have moved in with Jodie. There's 2 other underage children living in another house, and then there's 2 older kids that have now left. They're over 18. So in August of 2023, a neighbour of Jodie's calls police, and this is where everything changes. Can you take us through what happened that day? Because it was 12-year-old Russell that blew the lid on everything.
Yeah. So it's Ivins, Utah. We're at Jodie's compound, and then you can't really call it a house. It literally looks like an evil supervillain's like home base in the middle of the mountains. And it's a very quiet community. And this man opens his door, knock at the door, and he finds a barefoot, injured young boy who's asking for food and water. And he's asking for help. His ankles are taped up, but he won't say why. Duct tape around his ankles, clearly covering sores. He has them around his wrists. And the man breaks down in tears. It's one of the most harrowing phone calls I've ever heard. For a grown man to be brought to tears just by the presence and by the visuals of this young boy, But then he also reveals something very interesting on this call. There's been problems at this house before. He knows exactly where this kid came from. He knows he came from Jodie Hildebrandt's house. It's just a few hundred feet away. And Russell tells him that his mother is Ruby Franke. And so the man who has chosen not to be interviewed or spoken about this publicly since saves this child's life, but saves another life that he doesn't even aware of at this moment. And all of a sudden, like a bunch of different things happen this day, because what's really strange is what we found is that Ruby and Jodie are kind of in the background of everything that's going on this day, because when the police finally arrive, they go through Jodie's house and they find another child bound and tortured. And it's little Eve, whose 11th birthday is the next day on August 31st. And she is flat out refusing to go with the police, go with the ambulance to the hospital. Her brother has been transported to the hospital already. After 4 hours, Eve finally relents and goes to the hospital for treatment. And they had these open sores that were being patched up with cayenne pepper and honey, duct tape put around them. They were emaciated. They had their heads held under water. They were tortured. It's the only way to put it. They were tortured. And this is a 10 and a 12-year-old. It was her own children.
And when they searched that house, they came across, what are they? Are they safe rooms?
Yeah, so I've heard like varying accounts of this. And so they found even basically this panic room, which it's like a movie trope, but it exists in a lot of like wealthy people's homes. I've seen a couple of them myself, but it's essentially a room where nobody can hear you. Nobody can find you. And its purpose is to protect you. And unfortunately, this panic room was actually masking the abuse of these children. And who knows how long it had been going on. They had been living there for 3 months. Was it the entire time?
So Russell and Eve are taken to hospital. What happens next? Is Ruby arrested that day? Are the other kids found? What goes down?
What ends up happening that day is that they're told there are 2 other minor children living in the other house, Ruby's house in Springville. And the police go to Springville and they basically kick down the door. But there's no one there. There's no one living in the house. There's no one there. And come to find out that Ruby, when she found out that Russell had escaped, Ruby and Jodie were not at the house. Russell escaped when they had left for like a 30-minute period of time. And he had tried to escape before. So he knew that there were periods of time where they were gone. So Jodie wasn't home. Ruby wasn't home. We don't know where they were yet. And Ruby calls her friend, Pam Botcher, who is the 3rd member of Connections Classroom. And she says, Pam, you need to go to the rec center to pick up Julie and Abby. We have a family emergency. And Pam doesn't know, but she doesn't know why she's being asked to do this, but she goes and she picks up the kids and she brings them back to her house in American Fork. So this is 3 cities that this is all taking place in Utah. And it's like all over the state. These are hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So it's Ivins, American Fork, and Springville. And I'm sure, as most true crime fans know, police aren't very good at communicating, especially interdepartmentally, like across multiple cities, multiple jurisdictions. And so the police that end up knocking on Pam Botcher's door don't actually know why they're being asked to take these children. All they know is that they have a warrant to pick these children up and bring them back to the station. And Pam's husband, Roy, opens the door and he's immediately skeptical, as one would be. He's opening the door. He's wearing basketball shorts and a t-shirt. And he's like, wait, what do you want my wife for? And they're utterly confused. And I think a lot of people would look at this situation and go, like, Pam had to have known about what was going on, especially because she's the 3rd member of this little program that they were working, but she looks utterly bewildered when she gets to the door. She's like, "You have a warrant for my house?" Like the way she says it. And the girls are there. The girls are obscured on the body cam. Their faces are blurred out, but they're resistant. They're scared. We can only imagine why they're scared of police. Police have been to their house a bunch of times. So this is triggering for them.
But they weren't showing abuse signs like the other girl and boy.
No, they were not showing abuse signs, but throughout their childhood, the police had been called to their house multiple times. So I can only imagine just like how scary this was for these two young teenage girls. And Pam is put in handcuffs and brought to the back of the car. Roy is being a bit obstinate and standing in the way of the girls. He's trying to protect them. He doesn't understand what's going on. But they finally allow the police to talk to the girls, and they're resistant too. They don't want to go. They don't understand what's going on. Their mom's not there. Their dad's not there. And the police aren't telling them anything because they don't know anything. They don't even know that their mother's been arrested. I'm sure they might have an inkling because they know what's going on with their siblings. They know they haven't been living with their siblings for a few months. And if Sherry was aware of it and she didn't even live in the house, then I'm sure these two were aware of it. And eventually the police end up taking them into custody. And all we know about what happens with Ruby and Jodie is that they are arrested without incident on August 30th, but nothing is reported until August 31st. The next day is when this story actually sees the light of day because, you know, there wasn't really any fanfare about their arrest. They didn't put up a fight. There wasn't like a shootout. There wasn't a hostage situation or anything. They willingly went. And it's arrested without incident, as they say. And that's when this story like really blows up. And so Law and Crime, where I'm an executive producer at, they were the first to cover this story. And what ended up happening was they ripped all of the 8 passengers videos from the internet before like they were permanently deleted. And so that's how we're able to find out a lot of this backstory about the Frankies and about the Griffiths, is because Ruby tells a lot about her life in these videos. And so you're able to piece together just by watching this one, and this one, all this information about them because she reveals it. And I did want to add one thing about the family from the beginning is that they actually had a YouTube channel before 8 Passengers. It was called Full Suburban, and it's still up on YouTube. It's an early version of 8 Passengers. And Sherry is like super little in these videos. I think there's only 4 kids at this time. And they're really, you know, like grainy footage, like 2010, 2011 kind of digital camera video format. But you can even see in Sherry's eyes then that she's like, what are you people doing? Like, why do I have a camera being shoved in my face? And that channel didn't take off. But yeah, it's still up. And then when they created the quote 8 Passengers, which is a reference to this Full Suburban,
right? I was
AKA,
just thinking the car theme, right?
It's a car theme, right? Because I think that they meant for this channel to be adventures and like, you know, we're going to go to the zoo, we're going to go do this, we're going to go do that. But instead, it just became about their daily lives. So that's where the term 8 Passengers comes from.
Still on Sherry, she was very telling when her mum was arrested, posted on social media the words "finally." So we know that she had an idea that something bad was happening. Maybe she didn't know how bad.
I think Sherry was walking a very thin tightrope of what to do to protect her siblings and not to be in the warpath of her mother, because she knows what her mom is capable of. But she also loves and wants to protect her siblings. And so she's being put in a horrible situation where she's having to call the police on her own family to get them checked on because maybe she's too far away. She's studying in college and she can't be there all the time. And when Sherry posts this to her Instagram, finally, when the news breaks, her mother has been arrested on 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. Sherry posting finally to her Instagram should say enough about her guilt. Her own daughter. How crazy is that?
So we've talked about their arrests late August, and then things kind of happen quite quickly in terms of court world, because December 2023 is where everything starts going down in court, and Ruby does something pretty extraordinary. Can you take us through what happened? She basically did a plea, didn't she?
Yeah, Ruby took a plea, which I think surprised some and didn't surprise others. She very clearly did not want to put her children through a lengthy court trial. The American justice system is not kind to these people, especially in drawing out these trials. This trial could have taken place in like 2026. Especially if you waive your right to a speedy trial, as they say, they will take forever to get this into courts. And so for her, this is the one favor she does to her children, is that I'm going to own up to this because there's irrefutable proof. Her children are the proof that she had been abusing them. They were found at her friend's house where they had all been living. They're witnesses to their own abuse. Her own daughter is posting to Instagram that finally her mother's been arrested. I mean, she knows what she's up against. She takes the plea. And so then that leaves Jodie. What is Jodie going to do? And Jodie seems like the type of person that might want to take this to trial because she has a very high opinion of herself. And maybe I can get off of these charges. But when Ruby pleads guilty, it kind of leaves her no choice but to plead guilty as well. Because if Ruby's admitting to abusing her own children, you're damn right that she's going to go down for abusing Ruby's children. And that's pretty much like where the story is left off until February when they are sentenced formally. And Ruby ends up giving this really kind of crazy speech in court where she reads this letter where it's almost like an acceptance speech. She's like, I want to thank the judge and the prosecutors.
Yeah. It was like almost like, thank you for punishing me. Like I deserve this. But also it was very like accepting of what was happening. Were not her words, but it felt like she was very like, this is what must happen to me now.
But she also tries to reason with what she did, doesn't she?
100%. Yeah. It was so bizarre. So bizarre.
She thought what she was doing was right, as most people probably believe. You know, when you're in the action of doing anything, you either know you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. And so she'd brainwashed herself before she had even met Jodie that she was this authority on parenting and motherhood and truth and power. And, you know, she had convinced herself of those things. And now she's saying, I think I was right about some things, but, you know, obviously I took it a bit too far with Jodie. And so she's not totally absolving herself, but she's definitely trying to downplay it a lot.
What about Jodie? Does she do a little speech as well?
Jodie gives like a 2-sentence, that's usually what happens, a 2-sentence statement to the judge where she, you know, accepts her sentence, which is the same as Ruby's. They both get sentenced to the same very convoluted consecutive years in prison, which is explained thoroughly in our podcast. And I would definitely recommend listening to episode 6 to get like the full layout of how their charges worked. But Ruby, I don't know if she'll end up serving her entire sentence.
I know. And it's such a vague sentence. I mean, you'll know now. I don't think it's a spoiler, but it's like something like between 6 and 40 years. You know what I mean? It's like, does Australia do that?
Not to that extent. Like we usually have a non-parole period that's pretty strict. And then it's like the bigger sentence if you don't pass parole. But yeah, it is quite a confusing one because I thought it was like maybe 30 years that she was getting, but it could be as little as 6, you're saying.
Yeah.
Right.
So like this is also the really tough part about the American judicial system is that it's different in every state. And so Utah has this rule that if it's not homicide, you can't serve more than 30 years. This is a second-degree felony. And so the maximum they can serve, even if they have all these consecutive sentences, which means one after the other, and concurrent means serving at the same time, they have consecutive. So they're going to serve one sentence and then one sentence and then one sentence and then one sentence. But the max that they can do is 30. But people think that Ruby might get out in a few years. A lot of other people think Jodie's getting the full term because I think that there are people who have been trying to nail Jodie down for years And for what she had been doing to many people, especially operating without a license in the state of Utah as a therapist, she's a danger to society. Ruby's a danger to her children. Jodie's a danger to society.
I want to talk briefly about the plea agreement documents because they kind of go into some horrendous detail as to what happened to these little kids. I've read them. They made me feel unbelievably sick. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on them, and if you can share a little bit of the detail, we don't need it all, but I think a really telling way to describe them is the judge who called the situation that these two little kids were in like a concentration camp. He compared it to the Holocaust.
Here was count 1. Physical torture of Russell Franke is referred to as RF. He was forced to do physical tasks for hours and days at a time. He was forced to do wall sits, carry boxes full of books up and down stairs, work outside in the blistering heat, Utah desert heat, sunlight in the summer. He had sloughing skin and blisters from these sunburns, these serious, serious sunburns that he and his sister were both found with. He was denied water for days at a time. And when he was caught drinking water, he was punished. He was isolated from books, notebooks, electronics, entertainment from his sister, I'm assuming as well. Maybe they were kept in separate rooms, but he was kept away from everything. And that's just count 1. All of that was just count 1.
There were 6.
There were 6 counts, and then they only pled guilty to 4. They dropped 2 of the counts. And so the other counts were about the abuse inflicted on Eve, much of the same treatment that Russell was getting. But one thing that we found out in our interview with Jeremy Diaz was when Ruby pled guilty, what happens is that the district attorney and the police bring you into a room and they say, now that you've pled, we want you to tell us everything and nothing will be held against you because you've already pled guilty. So tell us everything you know, because now she said, I'm willing to testify against Jodie Hildebrandt if she decides to go to trial. Tell us everything you know. They call it a queen for the day agreement. And so this is when all of these details are revealed about what was going on, the waterboarding, the physical abuse and torture, the cayenne pepper honey on the wounds, the duct tape, they're being tied, being forced to stay outside, being denied food and water, being told you're evil and possessed, and being told these things that you're going through all of this, you have to carry books up the stairs because you're evil and you're possessed. This is being told to a 10 and a 12-year-old who trust their mom.
And that's the problem, that she was so sweet when she would say all of these things. It wasn't like a mom that was screaming like, da, 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 like a mean mom. She'd be like, because you're terrible, right? You know, sweetie, you get it, right? That's the demeanor that you get when you see her interacting with her kids and 8 passengers, telling them that they're bad with a smile and caressing them and with sweetness. And I think that just makes it so much worse because the kid doesn't think that the mom's evil. The kid's just like, this is just the truth.
So one thing that comes out in Jodie's plea is she adds one more detail to the abuse that Ruby left out. She tells the police that they made Eve jump into a cactus multiple times as punishment. I wonder why Ruby left that out.
Yeah.
I really do wonder why she left that detail out and why Jodie was left to reveal it.
Has Kevin responded to any of this? I know he has divorced Ruby now. What's happened since? Has he talked about it? Does he now have the children?
So no, the children are still in state custody. He's fighting to get custody of the children back. He wrote a letter to his state senator to get legislation in motion to do something about these unlicensed therapists that are operating in the state of Utah. And it's a very powerful letter that he writes. And the first 2 paragraphs he goes in on his soon-to-be ex-wife and the treatment of his children. He's disgusted by what he's learned about her. He can't believe that this is the woman he was going to spend the rest of his life with, that he had these 6 children with. This is somebody he doesn't even recognize anymore. And it's all in this letter that's read aloud by the state senator in the Utah State Senate. But yeah, he's still fighting for custody of his children to this day. And the state has to do a lot of investigating to make sure that it is true that he didn't know about this. And, that is the case. Like, this is what we know. Kevin has not been charged. He's not going to be charged. Pam has not been charged. Ruby and Jodie are the sole people responsible for this abuse, but they have to do everything to protect these children now. And they have to be very careful about who they put them back in the hands of.
Obviously protecting these poor children's privacy, but do we know if they're doing okay after everything they've been through?
I don't think we know. I can assume that they're going through a lot of therapy, that there's a lot of undoing that needs to be done, and it's not easy. Childhood years are the most important years of your life. And this is where you learn how to treat people and how you want to be treated. And this is when you're watching and listening to everything and you're learning and your brain's not fully developed. And to think about maybe the permanent physical scars that these kids are going to have is really, really heartbreaking.
You've both been investigating this story for a while now. You're still dropping episodes. You're still in the heartbeat of it. What are you hoping that viewers can take from deep diving on a story like this, from hearing all of these details, from seeing the decline of someone like this online? What can we learn, basically?
I think Ruby Franke and the 8 passengers saga is the tip of the iceberg. We are seeing all of these stories come out about what it's like to grow up on a family vlog on YouTube, to have your childhood posted without your consent because you didn't have rights when you were a child. Your parent was signing away your rights. They were shoving the camera in your face. And we're seeing these kids come out now who are now adults to say, I wish I could get my face off the internet. I wish nobody knew who I was. I wish I would have had a normal childhood. And some of it is just as simple as that. And a lot of these kids were being abused. And it's child labor. They're making money off of their children's likeness. They're not seeing any of the money that their parents made off of them. And what are we going to do about it as a society? Because this is new territory. The internet has only been around in its current form for like a decade. Like YouTube became like really popular in the last 15 years. And so there's a lot to reckon with here on a global scale, but on a national scale as well. Is like, we need legislation to protect children online. And there needs to be recourse, like something akin to reparations for what these kids are being subjected to. And so I think we're going to find all of these stories coming out over the next few years. We're already seeing like little drips and drabs of them, but that's the most important thing, is that we've got to protect children.
Yeah. And like, these channels thrive on views, and they only exist because of views and followers. And the fact that she had that many followers to allow her to keep going, and it just kept growing, even when she was already showing the abuse. I mean, it's also on us to not follow and to not view. As a society, we fed it. I mean, watching it, even if you were watching because you were horrified or because you were just like, oh, that's terrible, you're still watching and you're still putting $1 in her pocket every time she's doing that. So I don't know, there's something to be said about that.
Thanks to Paula and Jessica for assisting us to tell this story. To hear their full investigation into the Ruby Franke case, including first-hand interviews with people close to the case, take a listen to their Wondery Plus podcast, The Rise and Fall of Ruby Franke. The first episode is available to all listeners now on all major podcast publishers. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Moylan. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.